1993 was a turning point in the evolution of the web, because that year a new browser called Mosaic was released by Mark Andreessen, a 21-year-old undergraduate at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, working with his friend Eric Bina while they were at their jobs at the National Center for Supercomputing Applications. Because, at that time, several document browsers already existed, such as the World Wide Web created by Tim Berners-Lee and the Line Mode browser developed by Nicola Pello, and there were a few more coming online, some of the early browsers, but many of those were all tied to specific platforms, mostly Unix, and they had limited distribution and they were, quite frankly, hard to use. But Mosaic stood out because it was fast, intuitive, and cross-platform, meaning that it was available for Windows and Mac in addition to Unix. But the thing that was most important to note here is that Mosaic had its own killer feature, another killer app, if you will, because it introduced support for inline images. That is, images embedded directly in a web page rather than opening in a separate tab or a window. And that feature didn't exist in Timble's original HTML spec, which was entirely focused on text. There were not any images on web pages before Mosaic. And it was Mosaic that introduced the image tag to make inline graphics possible. So the Mosaic browser is where image tags worked, but everyone working on other web browsers copied the idea. And by the time HTML 2.0, the new specification, was actually formalized a few years later, the image tag had already become standard practice. And authors who were creating and publishing their own HTML documents on the internet, they all rushed to start using it. And this marked the beginning of what we now call the visual web. By the way, Mosaic also introduced now familiar features like the back and forward buttons, bookmarks, and the whole standard-looking, polished, windowed interface. Pretty much the same thing that you see in web browsers every day today. But for many people, it was the first time that the web actually felt usable when Mosaic first came out. And dare I say, it actually started to look pretty. But Tim Berners-Lee was not thrilled at first, because his version of the web and HTML was supposed to be a clean, semantic format, and the presentation layer was supposed to be handled just by the browser, not the author. But in time, he had to admit that the visual richness that is part of any document, well, that's what users wanted, and that would help the web take off. So, side story. I remember installing Mosaic on my IBM PC when I was working at Xerox in the early 1990s. I still remember the first website I visited because somehow I stumbled onto a web server hosted by, of all places, the University of Hawaii, where I found somebody's research paper on dinosaurs. And it blew my mind that by clicking a link, I was instantly looking at a document that came up so quickly and from so far away. And right there in the document, there were pictures of dinosaurs and artists' renderings, photos of bones, and photos of archaeological digs. And I know what you must be thinking is that, right now, it's like, wow, you boomers must have been easily entertained back then. But the fact that I was looking at something that wasn't on my computer a moment earlier, like a Word document or some other print-ready format, well, that was the part that was mind-blowing at the time. And then came the links. One paper connected to another, and needless to say, I didn't get a lot of Xerox work done that day. But I did start thinking about how this web thing might be used for other things, besides dinosaurs, and maybe something related to the marketing work that I was doing at Xerox. But more about that later. Anyway, Mosaic's popularity set off a kind of a chain reaction. Its developers went on to form a company called Netscape, which released the Netscape Navigator browser in 1994, which was a faster, more robust browser that quickly became the dominant browser on the internet. And basically everyone or anyone who knew anything about this thing called the World Wide Web, which was what we call this thing now, because remember, originally that was just the name of TBL's document browser, but everyone was totally into Netscape, including people at Microsoft. But more about that later too. The web's rapid rise in the mid-1990s was fueled by one key ingredient, the browser. But if you remember, the browser is just one half of the equation. You also need the server to make the web work. And we'll come back to that later, along with the rise of various web server platforms. But compared to browsers, the story of server software was relatively quiet. Important, but nowhere near as dramatic or as disruptive as what happened on the browser side with what we now call the browser wars. Marc Andreessen was vocal pretty early on about his belief that the web should be in support of commercial activity, which was quite a shift from the academic roots. In fact, when Netscape Navigator launched, it was one of the first browsers explicitly designed for commercial use. And this view clashed with some of the academic and open source communities, who at that time felt that the web should remain non-commercial. Mosaic made the web feel like a consumer-focused software product, not a science project. And the fact that it was free, certainly helped a lot. And this is a good moment to bring back something I said in the very first video. Some technologies, they get pulled in different directions that their inventors never imagined. So the web is a perfect example. As we go deeper into how it works, you'll notice that things feel odd, especially when it comes to stuff like e-commerce or the full-blown web apps that you're used to, because the core technologies, which always goes back to HTML, HTTP, and URLs, they were never designed for any of that. Remember what Tim Berners-Lee's focus was when he created it. It's written all over the invention. Hypertext markup language and hypertext transfer protocol and all these references to document this and document that. Everywhere you look into the technology of the web, you still see references to what it was originally designed to do. So keep on circling back to that first question of why was the web created in the first place? Because TBL built it to share academic research. Simple, open, and collaborative. But Andreessen had a different vision. He saw the web as a platform for business, media, and everyday users. And he believed it could become a commercial marketplace, So Navigator was built with that in mind. And that attitude ruffled the feathers of, everyone in the research world. But it set the stage for the web's explosive growth in the private sector. And that divergence in vision shaped everything that came next. That shift from research tool to commercial platform didn't just attract users, it attracted big tech. And back then, no company loomed larger in the 1990s than Microsoft. That success caught their attention.